The COVID-19 inquiry has moved its focus to Scotland. The proceedings have shifted to Edinburgh this week to examine how Scotland handled the pandemic. Today, First Minister Humza Yousaf was in the hot seat, but it's his predecessor who has been making headlines. Former First Minister Nicola Sturgeon surrendered her WhatsApps, or rather didn't, to the inquiry as evidence. And today, her former special advisor, aka a SPAD, as it will be mentioned in this evidence, Liz Lloyd, was giving evidence at the hearing, which meant the messages between the two got an airing. It turned out that those at the top of the Scottish government were not particularly impressed by their English counterparts, led then by Boris Johnson. Here's what Nicola Sturgeon had to say after Johnson announced a second national lockdown in October 2020.
On the 31st of October 2020 at 6:30 p.m, Prime Minister Boris Johnson began his address announcing the second national lockdown. And I want to pick up the messages between yourself and Nicola Sturgeon, which starts 10 minutes into the address. So if we read the first message on the 31st of October, at 6:40, you say, hitting the 15 minutes between the rugby and strictly to lock the country up. Let us never do this like this. Nicola Sturgeon replies, their comms are behind awful. We're not perfect, but we don't get nearly enough credit for how much better than them we are. She then replies, this is excruciating. Their comms are awful. Then she goes on to say, his utter incompetence in every sense is now offending me on behalf of politicians everywhere. You reply saying, I have a separate WhatsApp with, and the name's redacted, and Davy, and we are offended on behalf of SPADs everywhere. Nicola Sturgeon says, he is a f***ing clown.
Sturgeon didn't stop there. The full transcript of that exchange reveals another damning indictment of the Tory government. After Sturgeon asks Liz Lloyd if they should shut down now to try and get as much UK government funding for affected Scottish businesses as possible, she adds, they really are a shower. Now, two meanings are possible here. For those not familiar with slang, shower is usually followed by of and a word that rhymes with hunt. Alternatively, it could be a shower of shit. Take your pick. In that same session, Liz Lloyd was further quizzed about the relationship between Boris Johnson and her former boss.
Is it fair to say that the relationship between Nicola Sturgeon and Boris Johnson, by this date, had completely broken down?
I think broken down to a degree overstates what was there to break. They had met on a number of occasions. There was always a politeness, a business-like approach to it. When Boris Johnson first became Prime Minister and came to meet Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland, they had a discussion that I think has been described publicly as well as it was more like a debate, two intelligent people engaged in discussion about policy issues. When we got to COVID, I think it was much harder. It was evident in his exchanges with the Scottish government, with the First Minister, and I think with the other First Ministers, because we would all be on the same call, that he didn't want to be on those calls. He wasn't necessarily well briefed on those calls, and he wasn't listening to the points we were making on those calls. And so I think engagement with him came to be seen as slightly pointless during this period.
Something quite interesting about those messages is that on social media, fake messages, including a description of Nicola Sturgeon apparently calling Boris Johnson a marzipan dildo, which didn't happen, went round, and people really believed that that's what she said. So maybe that sums up the view people have of political leaders at this point. It's also worth noting that Scottish leaders don't exactly come out of this smelling of roses either, because when I said Nicola Sturgeon handed over all her WhatsApps, that wasn't exactly accurate. She'd previously deleted all pandemic-related WhatsApp, saying that was the government advice given to her. She also claimed she didn't use that platform to make decisions during the pandemic period. But evidence set out during the inquiry suggests differently. At one point, Sturgeon and Liz Lloyd were shown discussing a decision on the numbers of people allowed at a wedding. And in another 2020 exchange, they talked about putting pressure on the UK government to expand the furlough scheme to Scotland. Liz Lloyd says this. My reason for setting a timeline for them to answer us on furlough is purely political, especially as we'd expect the answer to be no. It looks awful for them, and creating that kind of pressure could possibly result in a yes, though agree we shouldn't bank on it. Think I just want a good old-fashioned rammy so I can think about something other than sick people. Nicola Sturgeon. Yeah, I get it, and it might be worth doing. I've sent a rough formulation of what I might say tomorrow. I could for it in there. Now, what Liz Lloyd says there could and has been interpreted in some places as a dismissal of those sick with COVID-19. I'm actually not so sure. Maybe I'm being generous, but to me, I see it kind of more as clumsy wording about also wanting to focus on policy for those who weren't sick yet, but still impacted by the lockdowns. Anyway, this is how Liz Lloyd herself explained it.
I think this is an expression of frustration that we were not able to manage the pandemic at this point in time in the way that we wanted. And I mean, a good old-fashioned rammy is language I would rarely use, actually, but, is that we needed to have the argument in public. There were a lot of things in COVID where we didn't have the argument in public. There were a lot of things in COVID where the UK government did something and we just let it go, or they didn't do something and we just let it go.
Lloyd also said the UK government made decisions based on England and not the other three nations that are part of the UK.
This was the issue, was that finance decisions that related to mitigating public health measures were not coordinated with the decisions each of the four nations might make on those public health measures. They were only triggered, if you like, when England took a decision, and Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland all faced significant difficulties during this period for that reason.
The airing out of Sturgeon and Liz Lloyd's messages actually led to an apology by current First Minister Humza Yousaf when he hit the chair in the afternoon. Yousaf said this: "Let me unreservedly apologise to this inquiry, but also to those who are mourning the loss of a loved one that was bereaved by COVID for the government's, frankly, poor handling of the various requests in relation to informal messages. There's no excuse for it. We should have done better." Yousaf has also announced an independent review into the use of mobile messaging apps in the Scottish government. What's interesting is that BBC analysis suggests that Scotland and England had roughly similar and horribly high death rates during the COVID-19 pandemic. But, Polly, most of the headlines today have actually just focused on Sturgeon insulting Boris, or WhatsApp being used for government communications, which kind of, to me, smacks of Hillary, those emails. Are we kind of missing the real stories amid the pantomime?
When I started in my role at Novara as Labour correspondent, a big question that I was getting asked by, MPs or by other journalists was, where have all these strikes come from? And I would say that there isn't so often on picket lines, almost no picket line I stand on where people don't say the experience of working through COVID really radicalized me. And that can be in obvious ways, that can be, like in areas where we might expect, like junior doctors, or medical professionals. But it crops up everywhere. It crops up with, refuse collectors. It crops up, with nurses. It crops up with teachers, teachers who had to fight the government because they didn't feel that it was appropriate to go back to school when the government wanted to push them to. There was so much of that anger and so much of the way in which COVID changed how we work that just wasn't captured, because if you read the news, you would be very, very well informed about the latest squabble, between X MP and Y MP. I spent COVID working, I was a key worker. I was working in a food shop, and, we sold food and medicines. And the experiences I had in that time are the reason I write about work, because I had always worked in retail, and I went into this job thinking it would be like no other. And the experiences I went through were really shocking. I had customers say, "I won't let you serve me unless you take that mask off." I served customers who would come into the very small shop where the only point of ventilation was a door, that opened onto the street that we had to have open come wind, come rain, come shine, who would come into the shop without a mask, bump into a friend in the shop and put their mask on to talk to their friend and then take it off to be served by me. I think the violence of COVID and those experiences, that's what the inquiry is meant to attest to. The inquiry is meant to answer the question of why did we let people experience, put their lives in such danger? Why did people die? Because why was the government not equipped to protect people so that people didn't have to go to work, without PPE? But instead, here we are again in another circus. And yes, I'll admit that Nicola Sturgeon's insults are quite funny. I was laughing off screen when you were reading them, but I really cannot help but think that this is all part of the same problem, And if you go back to 2021, Rishi Sunak as Chancellor refused to wear a mask in the crowded House of Commons. That was around the same time, I imagine I was working and I had people coming into the shop and I had to say, oh, I'm so sorry, excuse me, could you put your mask on? So I think that the government disdain for working people, for people who, put their lives on the line during COVID is as then as it is now. And so, yes, whilst entertaining, I think that it is a real distraction from conversations that we've not really had. I think that we haven't drawn out that thread well enough to say, hold on a minute, what did being designated a key worker do to people's psyches that meant they wanted to take strike action, that meant that, they might have had these conditions for many years, but they weren't going out, they weren't balloting. What were the ways in which COVID reconstituted work? I would rather see 5 to 10 articles about how, work changed and work was changed by COVID than the amount of lines of media copy that will be given over to this.